My name is Nakashima from the Graduate School of Agricultural and Life Sciences. I'm a faculty member of a science department, but as noted in my introduction, I have an academic background in the social sciences, originally specializing in agricultural economics. I've been studying for many years the academic field of food system studies, which is related to today's theme of food systems. In today's lecture, I would like to discuss current challenges related to food and the issues that need to be resolved. As you all know, in order to live, we must eat. If you're 25 years old, you've experienced approximately 27,375 meals in your lifetime. That's 3 meals per day, 365 days per year, for 25 years. Because you have accumulated extensive food-related experience, I'm certain each of you has your own thoughts and perspectives on food. After today's lecture, I welcome your questions drawn from both your personal experiences and my presentation. The lecture itself will largely focus on macro-level discussions and may involve somewhat abstract concepts. Because we have limited time today, I've structured the lecture in this way, although there may be some topics that I would like to discuss in more detail. In addition, because I titled today's lecture Implications of the Japanese Experience, I will speak mainly with Japan in mind. However, because Japan is globalizing, I will also talk a little bit about the world, but please forgive me if I limit the discussion mostly to Japan. I would like to structure today's lecture around the 4 main topics shown here. If we have time, I would also like to touch on a theme that I've indicated as a reference. This is a theme derived from research currently underway in our laboratory. Let's move to the first topic. Thinking about food. Here, I show 3 major characteristics of the food system observed in Japan. The first one is that Japan has a rich variety of food to be enjoyed. As noted in the items under this characteristic, many inbound tourists from abroad are now coming to Japan to enjoy the food. Many people say that Japanese food is something to be proud of. I think such a rich food culture is supported by the abundance of food available here in Japan. This topic relates to the second point, food security. As I will discuss later, food security is actually being threatened. When food security is vulnerable, enjoyable food, as listed at the top here, may be threatened. I will talk about the reality of this situation. Then, as indicated in the third item, I will discuss the promotion of sustainability-conscious diets. Food is becoming an area where sustainability must be considered. I will discuss the specific challenges later in this lecture. I won't go into the details of each of these, but there are several issues, as shown here. By the way, I would like you to think about food consumption. As I mentioned earlier, everyone must eat in order to live. You probably eat every day. In this respect, food consumption may be unique when compared with other types of consumption. There exists the additional issue of how we eat. I've written a bit here about this dualism regarding attitudes toward food. There are times when we eat without caution, and there are times when we eat with intense interest. In our laboratory, we sometimes discuss food for living and food for enjoyment. Depending on the case, the way we perceive food can differ dramatically. This will give a different impression. As we will discuss later, the policies that need to be implemented for food will also be very different. And, because we eat similar meals every day, we gradually burn out on eating them. And if you have to eat food, you must consider its safety. We also need to consider the cost of food. To provide food while taking these various factors into consideration, it is necessary to have solid food systems. The key word is trust.
必要になってきます。で、キーワードは実はこの信頼ということになります。
Here is a table showing the frequency of purchases per household per month. This is a statistic reported by the Japanese government. I won't go into details, but as you can see here, households made an average of 260 consumption expenditures in 2015. These expenditures include all purchases such as buying goods, receiving services, going to attractions, and so on. However, 207 or 208 of those expenditures represent food consumption. When we buy or consume things, we make a lot of decisions, and we make most of these decisions with regard to food. Making these decisions is, in reality, a significant burden for us. We have to make decisions every time we consume. Here is additional data derived from the same government statistics, but with the vertical axis showing how much money we spent per expenditure, and the horizontal axis showing the number of times we make a purchase per year. For example, the expenditure for sushi is high per occurrence, with sushi being consumed approximately 4 times per year. You have opportunities to buy and eat it approximately 4 times per year. However, most of the other food stuff is inexpensive, which is a characteristic of food as a consumer good. Although I am somewhat repeating myself here, food is characterized by high frequency of consumption and a low unit price. The top item, non-durable goods, refers to goods that disappear after being consumed. We repeat these things every day. As discussed, we must keep eating. We need a system to make eating as stress-free as possible and, in some cases, very enjoyable. This is also the essence of food systems. I would also like to ask you to consider food systems from a slightly different perspective called industrialization of eating behavior. As you can see in the figure here, we have to search for and capture food in order to eat. We must first find something to eat. Then we have to cook it. Finding the food is indicated here, and an act of cooking becomes necessary. Food is then chewed, masticated, swallowed, and absorbed in the body. We cannot obtain nutrition without going through this process. However, securing all foodstuffs ourselves would take a tremendous amount of time. Over the course of our long history, humankind has come to leave the feeding process, as shown on this left side part, to the primary industries, mainly agriculture. This is called the first step in the externalization of food. Today, we sometimes eat at restaurants, which is also the externalization of food. Our essential food behavior, from left to right, has become increasingly externalized, which has made food readily available to us. As a result, we can carry out work other than securing food. I believe that people becoming able to perform tasks other than securing foodstuffs has led to the development of industries and the creation of today's affluent society. I cannot discuss the details here now, but when we examine the food system as a whole, industry was formed by externalization of the processes from left to right. For example, intake is the act of chewing and swallowing by oneself. It is therefore considered impossible to externalize and leave to others. Recently, however, various easy-to-chew and easy-to-swallow meals, such as nursing food, have become available. These are actually examples of the externalization of intake. A new market is emerging. A process of disposal is shown here. A movement to link discarded items to various businesses has recently emerged. I believe this movement is another point of externalization and industrialization. I have referred to the term food systems without defining it. However, agriculture, processing, distribution, food service, and so on are all referred to as food systems as a whole. In this way, we have further advanced the acts of capturing and eating food through industrialization. Assembling meals and procuring the ingredients are only achievable with industrialization. Not only do we leave it to someone else to bring us what is in front of or near us, but we sometimes import ingredients from the other side of the globe, for example. This industrialization allows us not only to eat, but also to have a rich diet. In addition, even as our population grows, we must mass produce to provide sufficient meals. To this end, we are building factories and internationalizing the procurement of raw materials. Industry is also responsible for assuring the quality of the products it produces. People can cook and eat their own food. Gradually, however, food preparation is being left to the industrial sector. Industrial technologies are now surpassing home techniques. We are currently seeing food products available at prices that seem surprisingly low for what they are. Incidentally, among all household goods, the apparel industry was actually the first to transition from household production to industrial manufacturing. In the past, people commonly made their own clothes at home. Nowadays, however, home sewing is largely limited to a hobby activity, with clothing production left almost entirely to industry. Whether the food industry will follow the same path as the apparel industry remains a question for the future. Next, I would like to briefly discuss food security. The abundance and richness of food that I've just discussed is only possible with proper food security measures. As you probably know, many people around the world lack access to adequate food, which is a global challenge. Food shortages can indeed trigger conflicts, making the resolution of food-related challenges essential for maintaining global peace. In 2021, the United Nations held the Food Systems Summit. Although it unfortunately had to be conducted online because of the COVID-19 pandemic, high-level officials from approximately 150 countries participated in the event. The main point of the summit was measures that must be taken to eradicate hunger, and the Secretary General declared that food systems must be transformed as well. The words contribute, restore, and protect nature are climate neutral were added. The discussion is not limited to solving food problems, but also includes the pursuit of a sustainable society. For example, the Food Summit was held in 1996 as an international effort to address food issues. Then, in 2000, the Millennium Summit was held, where the goal was to halve, by 2015, the proportion of the population suffering from hunger in 1990. This figure shows the subsequent developments. Although I won't go into detail now, the food-related goals set in the Millennium Development Goals, MDGs, at the Millennium Summit have actually been achieved already, which was truly a remarkable accomplishment. These MDGs were later succeeded by the Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs. Goal 2 of the SDGs established a target of zero hunger, aimed at completely eradicating hunger worldwide, initiating numerous programs and efforts. As illustrated here, with these 8 target items, the goal encompasses more than just eliminating hunger. It includes a range of detailed and specific objectives to address various aspects of food security. The Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, or FAO, is responsible for these efforts and food issues. It publishes a report every year on the current state of food security and hunger. Here is a graph from one of those reports. As you saw earlier, between 2005 and approximately 2015, the percentage of undernourished people, and then the number of such people or population, steadily decreases. However, in 2015, when the period of the SDGs started, the decrease unfortunately stopped. In addition, these values have recently gone up because of the COVID-19 pandemic. We used to observe a decrease to an undernourished population of approximately 600 million. However, we now observe an increase to approximately 700 to 800 million for an undernourished population. In such a context, the Food Systems Summit of 2021 was just held. The summit gathered representatives of 150 countries together to discuss how to somehow achieve the SDG goals. The FAO has been working on this issue of hunger and food security for a long time. It has been analyzing the issue and has been developing policy measures based on its findings. For the FAO's definition of food security, please refer to the first paragraph of this slide. Given that this situation has not been well achieved, 4 dimensions have been established. The first one is food availability, which refers to whether food is being supplied. The second is food access, which addresses whether food that exists is actually in the hands of citizens and consumers. Third is utilization, which refers to whether people can actually consume the food they have access to. For example, poor sanitary conditions might mean that even when food is available, it cannot be safely consumed and therefore doesn't provide nutrition. The fourth dimension is stability, which addresses whether the 3 previously mentioned aspects, availability, access, and utilization, remain stable over time. We need to eat every day, and going without food for even a few days can harm our health. Therefore, having abundant food at some times but none at other times is meaningless. Stability is essential. This slide shows the kind of stability needed. The diagram here provides a detailed breakdown of these concepts. FAO has developed a logic model for food security that considers multiple levels: national, community, including regional and local, household, and individual levels. This model examines how food security is maintained across all of these different scales. In this slide, for example, problems of availability, stability, and accessibility are shown. If any part of a single element of the entire system, like one of the elements in this flowchart, causes a failure, then the final nutritional status of individuals will become poor. To achieve food security, policies are first needed. Then, businesses must become involved. All policies and businesses together comprise the food system. Recently, the FAO added 2 additional items to its definition of food security. Agency refers to people's ability to be involved in the process of shaping food system policies and governance, and how governance should be carried out. The other new item is sustainability. The FAO's policy states that food security must incorporate elements of environmental issues. The report also states that these additional dimensions have not yet been officially defined, but I believe it will become an important element in the future. As I've mentioned, environmental issues must be included in the discussion of food security and food systems, but the issue of climate change is also of particular importance.
ですが、非常に重視されているのがやはり気候変動の問題です。
This is a graph derived from the Working Group 3 of the 6th Assessment Report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC. It shows which sectors are emitting greenhouse gases. This slide shows that, of the total greenhouse gas emissions, 22% actually come from agriculture, forests, and land use, which cannot be overlooked. We need food to live, and we are creating various environmental burdens to produce food. However, I don't think it can serve as an indulgence. In addition, I am sure many of you are aware of the emergent concept of planetary boundaries, which strongly influence the discussions at the Food Systems Summit. This graph was pulled from a report by the International Food Policy Research Institute, IFPRI, which is a United Nations agency. It shows the estimated amount of land and water required and the amount of greenhouse gas emissions for each type of food produced. Specifically, it shows that beef production requires a lot of land, a lot of water, and emits a lot of greenhouse gases. However, it also shows that the production of items other than beef are also causing these problems. This figure shows the nitrogen cycle in food production. It describes how nitrogen, which is the source of protein needed to build our bodies, enters the food supply. In terms of nitrogen content, 25 million tons of food is supplied annually. Originally, 60 million tons of nitrogen was present in crops produced, but only 25 million tons remain in food. The loss arises from leakage and waste during plant distribution processes. When it is used as feed in livestock production routes, in particular, it often does not fully enter the food supply. It is metabolized to be lost. By producing a variety of foods, we're actually not using up this resource. However, we are placing a burden on the environment. When considering environmental issues, the issue of food loss also arises. This slide shows a graph estimating the amount of food loss. As reflected in this slide title, Food Loss and Waste in the Food Chain, food is produced, collected, processed, distributed, sold, and finally consumed. The collective processes are referred to as the food chain, and losses such as waste occur in each of these processes. For example, the second column represents Europe. The bar graph shows the loss and waste generated in each process. In order from the bottom, production, collection, processing, distribution, and consumption. We see that, in Europe, so-called developed countries are producing extensive loss in the consumption section. By contrast, in developing countries such as those in sub-Saharan Africa, most food loss occurs in the stages of production and collection. For example, there are numerous cases where, after wheat is harvested and prepared for shipment, rain leaks into the warehouse, causing high humidity. As a result, mold grows on the wheat, making it unusable. I believe that properly organizing such infrastructure is the first step to fundamentally reduce food loss. The food-related problems, in any case, must be solved. However, we know that food production also causes environmental problems. We want to increase production to improve food security, but doing so would lead to environmental degradation. Then, curbing production to improve the environment would worsen food security. In this context, I created a gear model to show that there is a dilemma between food issues and environmental issues. Simply increasing production is insufficient. At the Food Systems Summit, there were suggestions for possible alternative approaches to address this dilemma. Restricting production would lead to food shortages. The proposed alternative is to solve inefficiencies and problems within the existing food system to improve food security, even with production restrictions. This approach would lead to environmental improvements. This is one approach suggested. The other is that we still have to increase food production while simultaneously improving food security. There should be a way to improve the environment using new environmental technologies so that, even if production is increased, the environment will not be adversely affected. I have heard that these two paths were discussed at the Food Systems Summit. At the Food Systems Summit, each participant country announced the commitments to the actions it would implement itself. Although this slide is written in Japanese, in Japan, the Ministry of Agriculture, Forestry, and Fisheries, MAFF, is the ministry in charge. The MAFF developed a green food system strategy with the goals shown here and presented them as Japan's commitments. For example, the targets include reducing the use of chemical pesticides by 50% by 2050 and expanding the area of organic farming to 50%. I have talked briefly about overseas trends, but going forward, I would like to talk more about the food situation in Japan. In the context of Japan, food self-sufficiency rates are often cited. The most noteworthy among them is the calorie basis food self-sufficiency rate, which is shown in purple here. Japan's food self-sufficiency rate is now below 40%, which represents this calorie-based one. It was actually approximately 80% in 1960. This ratio is thus only half of what it was. The reason for this change is that Japan has a population of more than 120 million people, but relatively little agricultural land and farmland compared to its population. As a result, Japan must import large quantities of agricultural products that are produced using land in other countries. This fact is demonstrated in this graph. This graph shows the calorie basis food self-sufficiency rate for major countries. While Japan's rate is very low at approximately 40%, countries such as Canada and Australia have rates that far exceed 100%, with some even reaching 200%. Looking at the top-ranked countries, you can see that nations with large land areas tend to have very high self-sufficiency rates. The left side of this graph shows the different food items that Japanese people consume and the self-sufficiency rate for each item. For example, rice is almost 100% self-sufficient. However, in the case of oils, the self-sufficiency rate has fallen to an extremely low level, meaning that Japan can barely satisfy any of its own oil needs. To ensure food security, we first want to establish a stable food supply. The means to achieve this is to produce domestically and to import. This is a rough figure, but Japan produces 40% of its calorie basis domestically and imports 60%. Regarding imports, there are certainly some items that cannot be produced domestically. We have no choice but to import these items. However, there are also items that we could produce domestically, but still import either because of insufficient domestic production or because they're cheaper to import. Although there are various opinions about this 40% self-sufficiency rate, many people have expressed concern about it. I wonder if you all agree. Nonetheless, we've managed to cope with this situation somehow. One key point is that Japan has long been able to import these items under favorable conditions.
都合の良い好条件でこの輸入をずっとすることができたというのがあります。
Therefore, there is a mindset that even if problems arise, imports can continue and that everything will be fine with the current low level of domestic production because we can continue importing. Certainly, if you look at the past, and I will show you later in the presentation if you are interested, for more than half of the years from the 1960s to the present, Japan has been able to import more grain than any other country in the world.
世界で一番穀物を輸入することができました。
However, we have encountered a bit of trouble lately. That is, crop prices have risen dramatically in a situation where we are highly dependent on imports. This graph of food price statistics from the FAO shows the prices from 1990 through 2000 to 2024.
年から2000年を超えて2024年までの数値なんですけども、
Prices rose dramatically around 2007 and 2008, after which the price level increased to a higher level than before and has remained at a high level.
レベルが一段と高止まりしています。
Moreover, prices have been fluctuating significantly. As a country heavily dependent on the international market for its food supply, Japan is in a challenging situation. This graph shows the global trends in grain production and imports, along with population growth.
人口の推移というのを示したものです。
The population is definitely increasing, and production has steadily increased to match this increase in population. This line shows imports.
輸入というのがあります。
Although this represents trade volume, the expansion in imports is significantly larger than the increase in production. That is, a system developed where some countries produced large amounts of food and countries with shortages would import it, leading to increased trade. This system became possible as a result of globalization, and around the middle of the first decade of the 2000s, there was a sudden expansion.
一気には急拡大しているということです。
This means that the number of people wanting food increased. As a result, as we saw earlier, prices have remained high.
というふうに考えられます。
I would like to return again to Japan's self-sufficiency rate for a moment. This is the trend of the calorie-based total food self-sufficiency rate that I discussed earlier. The first period, second period, and third to sixth periods are shown here. As you can see, there was a large decline in the first and second periods. The reason for this decline can be seen in the relationship between the green and the red lines. The self-sufficiency rate is the ratio of domestic supply/production to domestic consumption. Domestic supply is shown in red, and domestic consumption is shown in green. Because domestic consumption has increased rapidly, the rate of self-sufficiency has decreased dramatically because Japan's population has increased tremendously.
めちゃめちゃ増えたからです。
This outcome may have been inevitable. Let's jump down a bit and look at the fifth and sixth periods, which are roughly after 2000.
この5期と6期というところをちょっと見ていただきたいんですが、
The self-sufficiency rate remained at approximately 40%. However, it has recently been slowly declining. Looking at domestic production and consumption, which are the denominator and numerator, respectively, in the above calculation, we find that consumption has actually been declining during this period. If consumption is declining, the self-sufficiency rate would have increased if production had been maintained. However, the production showed the same or declining trend because, as you can see here, production has decreased. I've shown the factor breakdown of the self-sufficiency rate in the graph here, but I will skip it for the moment. As I mentioned earlier, a major problem in this country is that the population has grown tremendously.
一つ大きな問題です。
Locally, the population has been heavily concentrated in regions around Tokyo, Nagoya, and Osaka. A system was needed to supply food to the large numbers of people in these areas.
たくさんの人たちに食料を供給するシステムというものが求められていきます。
The wholesale market system was established as a mechanism to provide vegetables and other produce to people in these urban areas. Although Tokyo has an enormous population, people there can obtain food, particularly vegetables, without any problems today because of these wholesale markets. This kind of market has been established as a united network. The largest market, Ota Market, used to be located in front of Akihabara Station. However, it could not operate smoothly there and is now located next to Haneda Airport. It is a very large market. Here's a picture. Vegetables in Tokyo's markets, centered around the Ota Market, arrive from all across Japan. In the past, agricultural products arrived at Tokyo from farming areas surrounding the city. Currently, however, little food is produced in Tokyo itself. Most agricultural products are transported from Hokkaido, the Kanto region, and Kyushu. By having created these systems, food systems, Japan maintains its food supply. I mentioned earlier that the food supply has been decreasing significantly and that it continues to decrease. This trend is shown in red in this change in agricultural outputs chart. In fact, the production value of Japanese agriculture has been decreasing since 1980. The foremost reason for this continuous decline is that the number of farmers has decreased tremendously. The number of people working in the agricultural industry has also decreased dramatically. The amount of farmland has also been decreasing. Moreover, the investment in agriculture, which is required for industrial activities, has also continued to decline. The resources being invested in agriculture, including workforce, capital, and farmland, as well as other inputs such as fertilizers, are steadily declining. This graph shows the ratios of these changes. As shown here, the input has decreased dramatically. However, output/production hasn't decreased as much in comparison. This gap of decrease in output/production has been possible because technological innovation has enabled us to maintain relatively high production levels with fewer inputs. Incidentally, production is decreasing, but, as you saw earlier, consumption is also decreasing. Japanese consumption peaked in 1995 and has been declining ever since. This graph shows the reason for the continuous decline in values in monetary terms. When we break it down into factors, we see that, in the mid-1990s, people started avoiding expensive items. They stopped buying high-priced items. This behavior was likely due to the economic conditions. Thereafter, people's food consumption also started to decline in terms of calorific value per person per day. The recent factor of the population starting to decline has been added here. In the latest part of this graph, we can see a slight recovery in consumption. However, with a further or continuous decrease in population, consumption may decrease further in the future. I did not explain this graph earlier, but the food and beverage expense shown here is composed of fresh food, processed food, and eating out, or food service. Until the beginning of the 1990s, the proportion of food consumption changed dramatically. The way we eat has changed significantly. However, since the mid-90s, this ratio has not substantially changed. I myself lived through that period, and I would say that food has changed a lot. I think the way we eat and the way food is served has changed extensively. Incidentally, this type of food supply is supported by the various components of the food systems I mentioned earlier: agriculture, fisheries, and then the food manufacturing, distribution, and food service industries all support it. The food and beverage expenditures I mentioned earlier are made up of fresh food, processed food, and food service, and we can break down the contribution of each of these industries. Looking at this expenditure from the perspective of which industries are supporting it, we find that agriculture is decreasing rapidly, whereas the food processing, distribution, and restaurant industries are expanding. If we examine this as a percentage, we see that, until the 1990s, the composition of these industries changed substantially. Thus, food systems changed dramatically. However, since then, from 1995 to the present, the composition of the food systems has not substantially changed in terms of monetary value. However, the reality is that the food system has greatly changed. I've prepared some information, but I will skip ahead because of the time constraint. However, one thing I would like to talk about here is that one of the key factors that changed the food systems until the mid-1990s was the change in our desire to eat. Previously, we wanted luxury food, we wanted a variety of foods, and we wanted convenient food. Then, we wanted to eat healthy food. The food systems have put in place mechanisms to fulfill these desires. Research has demonstrated this. However, there hasn't been much research about this issue since then. One thing I would like to focus on is that, although the order of items is reversed somewhat, environmental orientation is definitely increasing. The other significant factor is that consumers are becoming more cost-conscious. As I discussed, consumers are no longer buying expensive items. For example, we now buy many meals at convenience stores, and I believe that the provision of food services such as this is the answer to consumers' desire to save money. In any event, the decline in consumption in the mid-1990s had a huge impact on the Japanese food system, which led to very poor performance of the agriculture and food industries. Prices did not go up, so there were no successors to the farming industry, and then the labor force shrank, farmland use declined, and domestic production therefore declined. I mentioned earlier that there are concerns about food security, and here are some key points. First, domestic production is likely to decline rapidly in the future because of a shortage of workers and investment. We've gradually come to understand that there are people who cannot access food even when it exists because of income inequality and regional disparities. We also depend heavily on imports. Our importing power has been declining because of decreased purchasing power and rising prices both domestically and internationally. In addition, there's the question of how to handle unexpected situations, contingencies we hadn't predicted. For example, we've seen disruption in international markets following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and climate change is making food production unstable. We've come to realize that we must prepare for such unexpected situations. In fact, the policies being developed today are generally constructed with the 1990s in mind. However, in retrospect, we now realize that this period was a period of temporary stability and that the policy structure was based on this temporary stability. Finally, I would like to say just a few more words. In light of these concerns, we are now making a major change in our food policy. Japan's agricultural and food policies are structured around the Basic Act on Food, Agriculture, and Rural Areas. This law has now been revised. On the basis of this law, we are now in the process of creating a basic action plan. The most important point in this process is the need to revise our food security policy. The concerns that I mentioned earlier are presented here as 4 concerns. As a result of the revision based on these concerns, these 6 points were included in the revised version. Particularly important is that food security for each citizen is at the center of the basic principle. The second is to make food systems in harmony with the environment a new basic principle. This topic is exactly what was discussed at the UN Food Systems Summit mentioned earlier, and is reflected in our domestic policies. Japan has already created the Green Food System Strategy, and we have included it in the basic law. This is the last slide for today, which indicates provisions of the revised law. As you can see, the provisions include the discussion about food security and the establishment of food systems in harmony with the environment. However, it is not so easy to achieve this. In the revision process, a request for cooperation from consumers was written into the law. Specifically, the article states that consumers shall play an active role in improving the consumption of food while contributing to the sustainable supply of food by striving to select, when consuming food, items that contribute to the reduction of the burden on the environment and other items that contribute to the sustainable supply of food. However, whether consumers will really do this just because it is written into law remains a big question. In fact, the market for organic agricultural products in Japan is very limited compared with those in other developed countries. Expanding this market will require various dialogues, policies, and industry initiatives. I have many expectations, but I think it might be difficult, which is actually what we found in our laboratory research. I apologize, but we've gone quite over time. Although I have more slides prepared, I'd like to end our talk here. I'm sorry for running long. Thank you very much.